Managing Violence Podcast, episode 83. We're talking Asphalt Anthropology with Beverly Baker. It's a good one. Make sure you stick around. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another episode of the Managing Violence Podcast. It is my absolute pleasure today to be joined by Beverly Baker from Asphalt Anthropology, or the Metro Finishing School. And Bev has a really unique take on self-defense training or in self-protection. Her whole emphasis is on how to navigate massive cities, so hence Asphalt Anthropology, and how to make use of crowded environments, of all the things that go into the cityscape, all the risks, all the opportunities, all the things we have available to us. It's a really interesting conversation as we unpack some of the elements of goes into metro survival. It's really prevention and preparation taken to a whole new level. So I think you'll get a lot of value out of this. You may notice, if you normally watch our show on YouTube, you'll notice that this one is audio only. We had all sorts of tech gremlins during the recording process. We ended up having to kill our video. There's a bit of editing going on with the audio as well. I think we've resolved those for the future, but we had to sort of navigate it on the fly while we had the opportunity to interview. So I apologize for the lack of video for today, but hopefully the audio is strong enough to keep you here. And certainly the content is fantastic from Bev. If you would like to hear bonus content from Bev, make sure you check out our Patreon, patreon.com/managingviolence. Also, don't forget that if you would like a discount, it's quite generous discount off high-quality martial arts gear, you can check out Fuji Sports, both in the US and in Australia. The links are in the show notes. To click on the link and use the coupon code MVP10 to get 10% off your order at Fuji Sports. We thank them very much for supporting the show. All right, here we go. Here is the one and only Miss Beverly Baker. I'm joined here on the Managing Violence Podcast by Beverly Baker. Bev, thanks for joining us. It's been great to get you on the show. It's been a bit of a journey, but we've got there.
Hi, Joe. Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited to talk to you.
Bev, for those that don't know anything about you, rather than me trying to read a CV off the website, let's hear it direct from you. Who are you? Where have you come from? What's your journey? Let's walk us through. How did this all get started for you?
Yeah, sure. So my name's Beverly Baker. I'm based in Los Angeles, California. I teach a class called Asphalt Anthropology, and talking about evolutions, that has been an evolution to create and teach that class. I started out in high school over 30 years ago doing martial arts simply because I was into sports and I love the athletic side of it. And then a few years into that as a woman who is okay with kicking and punching and getting hit and really enjoying those things, you kind of get shoehorned into doing self-defense, teaching those classes. It was not something I necessarily set out to do, but it was kind of an expectation particularly in the traditional Asian martial arts. I have a second degree black belt in a system called Xianru. So that's where I first started dabbling in that and learning from my instructors, teaching technique, teaching things like boundary setting, using your voice, things that I now call mainstream self-defense that are really, I think, important and have given me a lot of tools for my life. And we'll get into this more a little later, not that I run around punching and kicking people or yelling at them, but it's, I think of myself as more of an urban explorer before I even think of myself as a self-defense instructor. I've been teaching self-defense for over 20 years, but when I was 10 years old, I would get into conflict with my parents because I just wanted to go out and walk in the city. And it's just a place that I find very peaceful, is to explore a city. And of course, and you have a young daughter, I'm sure you might have feelings about that. And, I've had some run-ins. I remember I was catcalled for the first time when I was about 10, walking along with a girlfriend of mine. And didn't know what it was, right? I just knew this car full of men was slowed down and creeping and saying things that were very frightening to us. And I didn't know what to do. So I just turned and I yelled at them to go fuck off. And it worked, thank goodness. And that was my first encounter. And so I feel like, even as a teenager, I'd take the train into Philly and just kind of learning, how to carry myself, how to interact with people. Really kind of comes down to just kind of being cool, being respectful, not getting yourself backed into a corner. There's a lot more specifics we can get into, but I feel like even before I became a self-defense instructor, the street and exploring was really my place of education. And that's where I specialize. For about 20 years, I've been teaching, again, more mainstream self-defense. What do you do when someone grabs you? What do how do you throw a punch? And those are all great. But when I moved to Los Angeles about 10 years ago, I realized that a lot of things that I had been teaching that I was told was important and that I passed along actually didn't really hold a lot of water in the environment that I was in. So in Los Angeles, I live in the entertainment slash tourist district. It's a block and a half off of Hollywood Boulevard, where all the stars are in the Walk of Fame and the Chinese Theater. It's a very fun, electric place to be. And I really enjoy it. My husband is in the tourism industry, so it makes sense that we live here and we just enjoy that kind of, like electric lifestyle. But if you walk around with your quote head on a swivel here, you're going to have like a stress-induced heart attack in probably a week because everything looks like an emergency. And so I really found that a lot of the common advice that we hear getting passed around in self-defense circles, they might work in places that are less intense. I'm not saying just throw the baby out with the bathwater, but I found that they weren't nuanced enough for the environment that I found myself in. So I kind of went back to my roots as a teenager in Philly, kind of like how do you navigate, kind of combining that a little bit with traditional mainstream self-defense, and then developing Asphalt. And my target audience is professional people who live and work and play in dense public spaces. The principles apply almost anywhere, but they could be a little bit like overkill if you're living in a more spread out place, right? Like, so for example, you always hear if you're walking down the street and someone looks sketchy, just cross the street. And that's probably great advice for most places. But here in LA, we have a homeless population of over 60,000 people. The LAPD gets over 20,000 mental health calls per year. I know I've had at least a dozen run-ins with mentally ill people, and I've never called. So I don't know how many calls are not getting captured in that data. So if you were to like cross the street every time someone were to look a bit sketchy or feel a bit off, you'd be zigzagging the street and you just wouldn't get anywhere. So it's more about employing your environment. I do walkthroughs with people of the city. We look for, okay, if someone's on that corner freaking out, what are some options? Because you can't cross the street, right? There's cars coming. So we look for places to conceal or cover. We look for places, even using other people, just to kind of put distance between you and a potential threat. So that's more of what Asphalt is about.
That's really fascinating to me because I draw so many parallels to early days of my career. I went through and did some executive protection training,
Yeah,
and just sort of working through those sort of situations, walking down the street. Okay, where are your potential choke points? Where
right.
are the areas that, whether you're driving or whether you're on foot, like where are the potential obstacles going to come from? Recognizing those early, figuring out
Yep,
contingencies on the fly.
yep,
Obviously, if you've been in the area more frequently, then you have a sort of a data bank of what these are. But at the same time, if you're overseas, you're in a completely different environment where you don't know what normal is.
right.
That can be really, really challenging. And there's so much value to what you're saying there about it's not just about punching, right? It's about recognizing what the potential threat situations are, not just having situational awareness, which I think we all preach situational awareness, which
Sure.
is fundamental, but also the ability to assess the threat and to see whether this is actually something that, like you said, you've had a dozen run-ins with mentally ill people that you've never called the police. So therefore, some part of you assess that threat and go, I'm not in immediate risk. Here's some other things I can do to get myself away from this uncomfortable situation. So
Yeah.
that assessment is crucial, but I love that because that is really self-defense, right? And yeah, it's amazing.
Well, and one thing, and I think you can't teach for it and you can't plan for it because you don't know what the context will be. Like you can play and you can, and I encourage that play and I encourage that training. But like, so here's a situation. This happened early when COVID hit, and it happened a few months in. And for folks who've heard me on other podcasts, I've told the story, but I think it's an important one to underscore what you just said about is the kicking and punching a solution, and the answer being no. So I was out on the street, and they were pretty deserted because of the lockdowns, and not many tourists, things like that. And so I was just out for a walk because that's what I love to do. I clear my head and I go out for a walk. And as I was coming back, I was right in front of the Chinese theater, and I looked up, and there were about 4 young men who, as tourists always do on Hollywood Boulevard, they're like spread out across the sidewalk because they're all looking at the stars, and they're not really paying attention. And I'm like, oh, with COVID, how am I going to cross? I'm looking ahead, trying to figure this out. And as I'm looking ahead, focused on them, I spot in the corner of my eye a guy who had been living on the street, was very disheveled, and he was kind of walking fast in our general direction. But I was more focused on these 4 young men. And suddenly I heard bitch, like just loud. And he caught, like, my head went over to him, and he was charging at me. And it was terrifying. I was being charged at by someone in a primitive primal state. And I always, the lesson for me is if these were our self-defense partners in self-defense classes who weren't bathed, who look like they might be carrying some, diseases that they might have picked up, we would not be going hands-on. I've been in classes where the instructor has to lecture, okay, everybody, make sure your outfits are clean, you've taken a bath, because we don't want to work with stinky partners. Here was a guy coming at me who, I don't know when he would have bathed. He looked like he'd been living hard on the street. And so all I could think of, like, he wasn't going to get close enough for me to do a groin kick or a punch like that. Like, and plus COVID, right? Like, then there's that aspect. So I'm like thinking about all these things in matters of seconds. So as the 4 young men, he was still behind them. And as the 4 young men were coming in my direction, I said, hey, would you guys mind if I walked with you? And they're like, yeah, sure, no problem. And so I walked with one in the middle, and then the others were flanked. And thank God that they were there to do that, and that they said yes. And it was interesting because the guy kept circling, right? Like, think about a lion circling wildebeest or whatever kind of prey. I was the weak one. I was the one. I was the old one, the lame one, the whatever French newborn that he wanted, and he was circling the pack. The guys, I love that they were there on either side, but I had to kind of keep working to position myself so that if he'd come over here, I'd move myself. So I tell that story because I don't know that that's something you can plan for, right? Like, you can plan for someone approaching you, you can plan for someone going to jump you, you can plan for a lot of things, but the fact that those guys were there was just luck. And it was luck that was in my favor. And so I was able to employ a social skill, use my pleading eyes. Hey, would you guys mind? And, it does not fit the Wonder Woman character I would like to think of myself, as I'm like beating the crap out of a bag on, during class night. But it's like, that's the reality, because I didn't feel like getting Hep A or COVID or whatever else I might get in that situation. So I just wanted to share that with you to illustrate exactly what you're talking about, Joe.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, I think there's so much applicability to what you're saying there. I mean, just from my younger years traveling, for example, I mean, while I was physically capable of dealing with most threats that may have come my way,
Yeah.
if you're a Farang, or you're a Gaijin, or you're a gringo in a foreign country,
Yeah.
it doesn't matter how justified you were in using physical force. If you beat up a citizen,
Yeah.
you're going to have a really bad time.
Yeah.
And regardless of whether it goes really, really, really bad, or you just end up spending a lot of money in travel insurance and have to go home early, it's still
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
really where you want to spend your holiday, right?
Right.
So there are a lot of situations like that. There are situations where, to your example, like, it's just not appropriate, or it's not safe to deal with the situation physically, or you might be in an environment where if you go hands-on, then other people are going to start going hands-on. You're going to cause a bit of a scene.
Right. Right.
we used to make the comment when I was bouncing in nightclubs that the worst customers to kick out were women, because as soon as a woman got argumentative, it would draw attention.
Yeah.
And as
Yeah.
the large male trying to talk to a young woman, you're always the bad guy. And
Yeah.
if she didn't want to leave and she wasn't going to leave, like if you have to go hands on and try and drag her out, immediately 50,
You're the bad guy.
like 15 blokes are going to stand up and have an issue with you, even though they've never seen her before, because she's a woman, you're a male, you're trying to force her out to do something she doesn't want to do, and you're immediately the bad guy. So you quickly learn like plan A through Z12 of how to handle that situation non-physically.
Yeah, you better have.
Because you're like,
yeah.
I'm just going to get punched by a bunch of strangers if I do this. So, yeah, it's amazing to be able to think laterally, like I said. I mean, all right, apologies for the technical difficulties there. I'll probably have to splice some stuff out. We had some COVID-related internet trouble, no doubt. So you were saying you had a counterpoint to the bouncer situation.
Well, it's not so much maybe a counterpoint, just like another perspective, because you're absolutely right in terms of, I've seen that, right? Like a big guy putting a hands on a woman, even if she's like needs to get thrown out of the club, it creates a problem for y'all. The other side of that is this was back in the 90s. I worked the door at a strip club. I just sat in a little booth with my tits pressed up to my chin and just collected IDs and cover charges and things like that. And I'm not sure what happened. We had great bouncers, and I'm not sure what happened, but at one point, like they stepped away or something, they weren't there. And these three young guys, it's always guys in three. These three young guys came in and they had their IDs, and I can't remember the situation now. They were fake or they were real, and they just weren't old enough. And I'd been through, this was in Texas, and they put you through all this training with Texas Alcohol Beverage Commission. And like I was told, like, if you let someone in and something happens, you're gonna get fired, you're gonna get sued. So I was taking my job very seriously. And so these three guys come in, it's a college town, they come in and they didn't have the appropriate IDs. So I was like, sorry guys, you can't come in, you got to go. Well, when the bouncers went to go handle something else, they slipped back in. And I was like, oh, that's my job. I'm like in my 20s, like I don't have anything to get sued for. Like I was just like, oh no. So I remember like going into the club after them and just like putting my finger in one of their chests. And I was like, you need to leave right now. And just like backing them up. And I'm like 5'4", and they were huge. And I wasn't like screaming, but I was probably just like that outsized chihuahua who just made enough noise, who it was actually effective. I was like, wow, I just threw three men out of a strip club. And all it was like my little finger. And so I think that kind of emphasizes what you were saying in terms of the support that a woman could get, and so I use that to my advantage.
Absolutely. Sometimes just like we call it a pattern interruption, right? When someone doesn't behave the way you expect them to behave, the amount of internal like cognitive dissonance that causes, where you're like, this is not the situation I expected, and I don't have the ability to make to adjust course, so therefore I'm just going to withdraw because I'm not really sure what I'm dealing with anymore.
Oh yeah. And that's something I learned young, is just to like let people think that you're crazier than they are, and to like and as a young female, like you are looked at in a certain way, right? And so there's a lot of things that aren't expected. And it's I've been in, so I'm 50 now, I turned 50 last month, and it's really interesting like how how I'm perceived by the world at large, how when I speak, like I have more credibility in some ways, but then, I'm overlooked in others. It's really interesting. So, I think especially for women, that's one thing to consider. Like, when you're younger, you're going to be perceived one way, and as you get older, something different. And I'm still figuring that out. I'm new to all this, getting old, so. But it's definitely a game changer.
You know what? That's actually a really valid point, because as you change your, I guess your station in life, whether it's your age, whether it's whether it's getting married, whether it's having kids, whether it's career, whatever it is, the way you see yourself evolves, and also the way other people see you, and the nature of the interactions that you have is different. I remember being in my early 20s, and I couldn't wait to be in my 30s because I felt like no one took me seriously because I was too young, especially in business. Like,
Yeah.
like no, and then
Yeah.
you get to you're in your 30s and everyone still thinks you're a baby. You're like, God damn it. Like, I want to, like, why won't you just take me seriously? And then you get to a certain age, you're like, okay, I could slow this down now. Like, can we just, like,
Yeah.
the
I
aging
tell
isn't as fun anymore. Can we slow it down? So,
Yeah, I don't know. I'm there with you sort of, but when I hit 50, I was like, yeah, like I can own this. I was listening and I'm so sorry, I can't remember her name, but I was listening to an interview you did with a young woman. She's out of Canada and
Savannah, probably.
I'm sorry, say again?
Either Savannah or Pam. Probably
It was
Savannah.
Savannah. It was Savannah. Because there was a conversation about being treated like a princess
Yes.
in martial arts training. And I was thinking about that. I'm like, well, I've never been treated as a princess. Like that's been not been my experience, but I've been definitely underestimated, overlooked, fetishized, disregarded, definitely underestimated. And it's like, I think that really changes, like the flavors of that change as you age, right? Like I'm like heavier than I used to be. And, I used to be in like really great shape and da, 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 da. And now, I've got a little, some, I say a little bit of a pudge. I got a pudge. And it's like, so when I'm training and if someone it's new, they act like I've never been on the floor before. Right. And so it's interesting how, in my 20s, I guess this is maybe the princess thing. It's like I remember going to a school and it's like, okay, everybody do your knuckle push-ups and ladies, you can do them on your knees. And for me, I'm just like, fuck that. Yeah. Now I have to do twice as many push-ups on my knuckles just because you brought up the knees. I'm not doing them on my knees. But then, that's also informed some of how asphalt has evolved too, because I have injuries that I've developed over the years. I can't with my right hand make a fully closed fist because of injuries I've had. I, have broken, bones and some of it's in training, some of it's just by being a klutz. Um, and sometimes I see expectations of what people are supposed to be doing in physical training and self-defense. It's like, yeah, my shoulder doesn't move like that is the first thing that pops into my head. So again, asphalt, it's like the idea is to be able to not go hands-on because I have people who are older in my classes. I have people who are in various levels of physical ability. I've had people show up in wheelchairs. And so it's like it's about embodying kind of moving through space in a way that it's not about like that old cliche of walk confidently, all that kind of stuff. It's just like navigating your space, knowing where you said the choke points are, knowing what the real trouble spots might be, discerning this crazy looking person from the crazy looking person who's actually going to do some damage. So that's yeah, all of this has been informed by age. I would say all, but a lot.
I mean, age is another word for experience, right? I mean, the more you walk the
There you go.
yeah, the more you walk the planet,
Yeah.
the more you observe, the more patterns you connect, the more dots you can join together. And
It's real sad.
like
Yeah.
you look at, I've got 4 young kids that are all actively trying to kill themselves at every moment, right? Like because
Oh
they
yeah.
don't have the wisdom to know that what they're doing is dangerous or what they're doing is going to
Right.
cause them problems because they haven't had that experience. We've sheltered them enough, and not in a negative way, but we've protected them enough that they haven't had to
Sure.
have catastrophic injuries or or have really terrible things happen to them, which I think is my job as a parent. But at the same time, you want them to just benefit from my experience a little bit. Can you just trust me that this is a bad idea?
Yeah, what's that balance? There's a balance there somewhere. So for me, and this is the other thing about the way I teach and my approach. So I've never had kids, and I've taught kids in self-defense and in martial arts, and I actually some of those kids have grown up, and I'm still close to now that they're adults and into their 30s, which just blows my mind. But I'm more of the child-free aunt who it's like, okay, you've been taught to be safe and kind and trusting by your parents, like now let's shake it up a little bit. And so those are some of the approaches that I take. So I don't ever at all underestimate what you as a parent have to deal with and like that fine line you have to walk. But I really enjoy the conversations I've had with folks young women who I've seen grow up and have had situations and I know their parents, and their parents are like some of the nicest people I've ever met. And I'll just say to this person, like, okay, if this person's treating you this way and stalking you in this gym environment or whatever it might be, time to switch up patterns, as you would say. It's like, I'm not going to give you the advice your mom would give you, but let's talk about this in a different way. So that's one thing that I feel like is missing in the self-defense world that I really want to draw attention to, is how interdisciplinary it is, in terms of, I can bring this, I can't bring the other, right? I can't bring the perspective of a parent, but I can bring this. And I feel like as a whole, self-defense has really defaulted to the physical, being the dominant kind of influence, or even forced professionals. And it's like, I've learned a lot from people in improv classes I've taken. I've learned a lot by studying neuroscience. I've learned a lot from sociologists. And that's what Asphalt. I try to bring those different perspectives together, because just one approach is the old expression, if everything's a hammer, it all looks like a nail.
100%. And that's actually the genesis behind the logo of the show, with our three circles is psychology, anthropology, and hopology. So
I love that.
So
yeah.
brain, people, and combatives, and that's basically, if you can understand those three things, that's probably a decent foundation for being able to manage violence. And like you, I actually hate the term self-defense, and every time I use it, like a kitten dies inside, because I just hate that term. But it's search engine optimization, right? You got to call yourself what people go looking for. I love Asphalt Anthropology. If you haven't copyrighted that, you probably should. But a question for you, like as we start to move through, I'd just like to sort of drill down and get some practical tips from you in terms of things you actually teach. You obviously you live and work in LA. Crazy city, big crazy city. I've been to LA once. I explored for like a day, and then I hid behind in my Airbnb for most of the rest of the time.
Nice. That's a strategy.
Can I tell you the most stressful experience of my life? It actually happened in LA. I picked up a rental car. I arrived from like a red-eye flight, like from Australia. So I'd been in the air for like 15 hours. I arrived in LA at 2 a.m. Got through your TSA, who had no sense of humor whatsoever. And I picked up a rental car, and I had to drive from LAX to where was I staying? Like somewhere near Long Beach. I think
that's not a fun drive.
No, well, I didn't know this, right? So I picked up the car. I got the GPS unit as well, so that I'd know where I was going. Now, keep in mind, this is actually the first time I've driven on the other side of the car, on the other side of the road. It's 2 a.m. It's like, and I get 10 minutes away from the airport, and the GPS dies. And
I feel
and it took me literally an hour and 4 stops to get directions back to the airport, because the first place I stopped was like a convenience store. The clerk was deaf, which was problematic when I was trying to get directions. The second one, the clerk didn't speak much English, which didn't help. And it took 2 more stops before someone was able to direct me back to the airport. And I got back there, and I was literally white knuckling, shaking at the wheel, like, the GPS doesn't work. They replaced it. I managed to get back to my Airbnb. But that was my first experience with LA. It did get better, but anyway, the point of that long-winded story is for people living in big metropolitan cities. And this isn't just women. This is everybody, right? What are some of the survival skills that you teach? What are some of the quirks that you teach about being able to operate and stay safe within those sort of environments?
So there's 2 approaches that I take in teaching, and one is top down, and the other is bottom up, and that's a phrase I've stolen with psychologists. In my day job as a business person, I work in a psychology group and manage business. But top down is the things that our thinking brain can easily recognize. It's part of that process. It's slower to process, right? That's why it's not to our best advantage, but it's good to be able to recognize patterns that you were talking about. It's things like recognizing pre-attack cues. It's recognizing things like situational proxemics. So if I'm sitting on an empty train and some guy comes and sits next to me, that's a red flag, and I should probably do something. Versus if I'm on an empty train and someone sits next to me, it's not that big a deal. sure, still watch your back, but you don't need to have a red flag if it was on an empty train. So making those distinctions, and again, those are all the top down. What I'm focusing a lot more on these days, because I feel like it's not quite as talked about in the self-defense space, is what I call bottom up processing. And that is what your primitive brain, it like works so much faster than your thinking brain. So I'm sure your audience is probably already familiar with the top down stuff, like the situational proxemics, pre-attack cues, body language, things like that. But what might be a new area for some folks to think about is the bottom up. And so there's some drills, and these all come from evidence-based studies that show that when your primitive brain and your thinking brain are working together, you actually do a better job of processing threat, and then not just processing it, but knowing what to do next. So if you're constantly on that high alert and saying, oh, I got to keep my head on a swivel and everybody's out to get me, that actually makes you worse at processing threat and knowing what to do, because you're just always on, like you always have that ambulance siren going in your head. So what I'm really emphasizing these days, and I work with people who live, work, travel, run businesses along Hollywood Boulevard or in downtown LA, where, on any given day, they may have someone come in and just like randomly try to start part of their store on fire. Like these are real stories. And so the big goal for them is to kind of calm the thinking brain down and to calm the primitive brain down, really turn that emergency light off. So an example of a bottom up drill, and these are things that you're not out there kicking and holding the bag and punching and things like that. These are actually more quiet to kind of still your primitive brain down. And so one of them is to sit quietly and to close your eyes and just start paying attention to your body. Scan from head to toe and just notice any tension, any ache, anything positive you might even be feeling in your body. I don't want to go negative with it. Just notice what's in your body. Then when you get from your head down to your toes, then you move your attention outward. And again, we're all working with sound here. And so you're listening to layers of sound. It might be the sound of a ceiling fan overhead. And then maybe you're hearing the next layer would be the refrigerator running in the next room. And then maybe a next level of sound would be a car alarm going off out in a parking lot outside. And so you observe those things for a few moments, and then you come back to your body, right? And you go through that scan again. And so you're shuttling back and forth. And I really love this exercise because it's about being in your body as well as being outside of your body. And it's building that muscle going back and forth. So you're not strictly just in one domain or the other. Because if you're in one domain and not the other, you're really, you can't act. You can't really do the next necessary step. So that's an example of some bottom up stuff. We also incorporate some improv exercises in our training. So that can look like working with a partner and doing an exercise called mirror where you face each other. And if I start moving my right hand, then in a waving gesture, then you do that. And then I start, if I'm the leader, I wave my right hand, you follow, and then I move my left leg and you follow. And you kind of, it's play, right? You go back and forth with that. And then eventually the person who is leading, they find the opening to follow. And so it becomes this dance that you're in. This is particularly effective with people. I work with folks who have experienced a lot of trauma. And so if I say, we're going to go hands on and, do some punching and like practice chokes, they're just out the door. Like it ain't going to happen. So this is an approach. And I don't feel like, everything has to be like hands on, balls to the wall, like let's beat the crap out of a bag or a partner or whatever. It's really about getting one used to being grounded in their body. Then they can take in their environment and adapt and roll with it. I hope that makes sense. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, that's actually some really interesting stuff there, and there's some parallels to a conversation I had with Rory Miller a little while ago about training intuition, and so much of training intuition from Rory's work is about really understanding what your brain is taking in, thinking about your sensations within your body, thinking about what you can hear, what you can smell, what you can see, and I guess creating a narrative around what those actually are,
Right.
so that you can consciously label it, which then allows you to more to be more informed in your intuitive decision making, rather than just I felt something.
Right. Right. Right.
They can go, well, actually, I know exactly what it is I felt and why I felt it, and now I know what I can do about it.
Right.
Uh, and I think like trusting your intuition is yeah, it's a good fundamental first step. But if you can inform that intuition to be able to make better intuitive decisions, then that's even better.
Right.
And that's I see a lot of parallels to what you're talking about there with the bottom up material.
Yeah.
And so,
And it's interesting because that is the first step. And then there's like the next step, right? Because then we also, a lot of times in self-defense, we think, always trust your intuition. Well, but we also have very biased intuition. And then the question is like, how do we know what our bias is? And we see that happening in terms of, like, here's an example. If I walk down the street and I've been conditioned, whether consciously or unconsciously, to be afraid of a Black person, I might clutch my bag a little bit tighter, right? But then if that's an unconscious or a conscious bias, then what there is to do is for me to like, hey, wait, what's going on? Like, is that person, what's their situational proxemics? What is their trajectory of their walk? And so I really hope to employ a lot of these tactics for people to actually dissipate a lot of fear. I think one thing that kind of irks me about the self-defense industry is it's so fear-based, and people deny it's fear-based, and then they go post a video about someone getting attacked in the next breath. And
absolutely.
it's like, let's take a breath here. And instead of like, if you're going to show me a video of that corner, then you need to show me all the other 365 days where something didn't happen, or maybe someone was successful. Like, let's look at the success of someone who didn't get jumped. So I feel like there's a lot of kind of, when we talk about intuition, there's, always err on the side of caution, right? If the goal is to be as safe as possible, do that. But I also think that we want to be able to kind of take it a step further, and take a look at our biases. And one of the most powerful books that I've read on this is by Amy Herman, called Visual Intelligence. And again, I'm a very interdisciplinary person. And so her background is, she's a lawyer, she's an art historian, and she teaches this class on how to look at art, to military cops, to doctors, to business professionals. To doctors, I think, is really interesting, right? Because their job is to diagnose something. And so when she teaches people to look at art, it's something that, like, we know the truth, right? Like, we can look at someone on the street and we can make up a story, and we might be right or we might not be right, and we'll never know. But with a piece of art, she has you like go through these exercises and look at it, and then identify, and it helps you identify your biases. And then you can go read the story. Well, it's like, this person was the lover of the artist, or it was an enemy of the artist, right? Like, you can only guess if you don't have that kind of that history written down. That's what's really interesting about her approach. And I really love her approach in terms of bias. I think that that's something that I'm challenging myself, and I'm challenging, my colleagues and my students. Really, what is our bias? Why did we make that judgment? It might be perfectly legitimate, or it might be perfectly unconscious. So it's worth looking at.
Oh, I 100% agree. And biases and heuristics is something that I teach a lot at the corporate level when we're talking about corporate conflict management, or conflict management with customers, or with stakeholders, in depending on who I'm teaching.
Yeah.
And understanding what your own bias is and what your own prejudices may be, regardless of whether you're a nice human being or not. And no one really thinks they're prejudiced.
Right, right.
No one ever goes, yeah, I'm a massive racist. Like, no one ever says that.
Right.
But we know they exist, right?
Right.
So about understanding even something obvious like race or sexual preference or gender or something like that can be a fairly obvious one. But we all have biases about slow walkers, or people that drive a certain way, or someone who eats a certain thing, or gives their child something in particular, right? We all have these value judgments that we attach because of either how we were raised, or our own experiences, or just our own independent values, and
Right.
projecting those onto others. There's so much stuff that can cause conflict because we don't realize we're accidentally being an asshole in that moment. Right?
Oh, that is so well said. And you got my number with slow walkers. That is a pet peeve.
Yeah, right. Yeah, or the spread out walkers, right?
Oh yeah, you totally got my number.
There you go. Yeah, like guys, if you're gonna walk slow, at least be single file. But
Right.
but
No, I made a deal with myself. As long as I live here, I can't judge a tourist for being a tourist. If it gets to me, then I have to leave because this was going on before I got here. So
yeah, it's a valid point. But to your point, I think understanding how you see the world, and there's a great book called Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel
oh,
Kahneman.
I love that book. I'm in the
Yeah.
middle of it right now.
Oh, awesome! Yeah,
Yeah.
it can be a hard read. I mean, it's a
Yeah,
great book, but it can be a slow read. It's not a page turner, I don't think. But that's just
Yeah,
that could be my
it's
bias. That could be my bias.
No, it is dense. I'll be honest with you, we're in March. I started it in January. Now, February, like my day job just went bananas and I didn't read anything anywhere. Yeah, like I didn't have the brain cells to rub together in February to I'm like, I can't even with that book. But it's absolutely like what you're saying. And in terms of, um, and this is another thing I'm in an inquiry about, Joe, and I don't have the answer to this. It's like, in terms of self-defense, like we're told the world is scary, and I've had scary experiences, but I've had more days where it's not been scary than it has been. And so, what's that balance? And again, it comes back to like what you're talking about with your kids. Like, what's that balance for even yourself as an adult to prepare to think about without making yourself terrified and scared and paranoid?
Yeah, I mean, look, for me, like on a personal level, not even as an instructor, but just as a practitioner, it was much easier and much more straightforward to train when I was in jobs where I was routinely involved in violence, because there was no second guessing whether I needed to train, how hard I needed to train, what situations I needed to train for. Like that was taken care of for me because my reality enforced that for me several days a week.
Yeah.
And you develop a certain level of acceptance that, okay, people are going to be like this. I'm going to deal with this. I need to train for this, right? It's pretty straightforward. But then when I sort of left that world and my life is much less violent now, I now deal with low level conflicts like you need to wear shoes. No, you need to wear shoes and pants, please. Like that's pretty much my conflict that I deal with every day. So it's like, how much time do I spend on knife defense? Yeah, how much time do I spend on home invaders with machetes? Like what amount of my week needs to be spent on these so low probability events, but high consequence events in the same token, right? So as a risk management point of view, like, yeah, it's low probability, but the consequence of not knowing how to deal with it is catastrophic. So what do you do? And I think it's that's a challenge for us when we're teaching self-defense or self-protection skills to regular people, is you don't want to create an unnecessary or inaccurate picture of their actual risk, because I think that's immoral, but you do want them to be awake and at least aware of what the potential risk is so that they're a little bit prepared for it. But then your imperative as a martial arts instructor or a self-defense instructor is that you need to keep your lights on. So you need students. And unfortunately, one of the most proven ways to market is through fear. And it's a shame because we sort of fall in this trap. We're like, I need more students. Oh, here's an event, or here's a CCTV of an incident that happened in my town to people that would probably benefit from my training. I'm going to share the hell out of it and get more people into my dojo. And at the same time, we've now just created this culture of fear from people that never would have been impacted by that situation. And I don't know what the answer is. It's a balance, right? As you said.
Well, I'm in a very privileged position of this is not my day job, right? Like I have a career that I love, and I've just kind of been in this world for so long, and just having these conversations that I just continue to teach. And my focus actually pre-COVID has been in working with homeless folks and people living in the Missions on Skid Row. And by the time folks in my experience right now, by the time we get together, they've been through some shit, and like they already know like they've been through it, right? I kind of don't even have any interest in trying to drum up business with people in the suburbs or some place that it's just like not even likely to happen. Like I don't personally, I don't feel that pull. I know that other people do, and I know that other people are doing that to make a difference and to keep people safe. But I just, for me, it's a little bit of a different approach. And then I do work in the corporate environment with Asphalt Anthropology. And you're right. I mean, people definitely reach out to me, and I connect with people when things happen. But I feel like by the time people get to me, they're already scared. And I feel like I'm trying to say, okay, let's break this down. Like, what are like what is your victim profile? Like, are you really at risk for this? And maybe the answer to that is yes. Okay, so let's figure this out. Like, what are some things you can do to mitigate that? But if the answer is no, and I'll tell you, I've worked with some folks. Again, my goal has been with Asphalt Anthropology is to work with people who never set foot into like a dojo and take a self-defense class, because I feel like some of those people are the folks who might be most vulnerable. And so I work with a number of older people and in their 60s, 70s, 80s. And Joe, I'll tell you a theme I've noticed with some older folks, not everybody, but there's a sense of, I'm older, so if I see someone younger doing something wrong, I should be able to call them out on it.
Mhm.
And how I kind of stumbled on this, I was talking to a woman who came to my class, and she wanted me to tell her how she could look mean. And she was like a very tiny older lady, late 60s. And I thought she was kidding, right? I didn't quite understand the question. And as I drilled down and started asking her questions about her experience, it's about when she, gets on the train and like she would basically scold people for doing things. And it was just like, okay, you might want to stop doing that, because if they're smoking on the train, they clearly don't give a shit about the rules, and they're definitely not going to give a shit about you. And so those at that level, I feel like let's have those conversations sooner rather than later. And I'm not trying to pigeonhole older folks and say they're all like that, but it's a little bit of a pattern that I've noticed. And like we talked about age earlier, it's like, yeah, I'm an old fogey now, and I could shake my finger at someone doing this or that, but it's like, what's that going to get me? It's like, if they don't respect society enough, they're not going to respect me. I'm nothing to them.
Yeah, there's so much truth in what you're saying, and to me, like one of the reasons I'm passionate about what I do now is I'm not dealing with I'm not teaching seminars anymore on defending yourself against terrorist attacks, right? Very rarely do I go that deep. Now it's like, how do we manage conflict? Because if you can manage conflict better, then you build better relationships. You end up having more productive life. And you like me, if you're not scared of violence, then it means you can give people more time. You can give people more benefit of the doubt, because you have the physical skill set. If this goes pear-shaped, I'm still okay. Therefore, I can actually engage a little bit more verbally, and you never know, you might actually build a relationship with someone that becomes fruitful, either for you or for them.
Yeah.
And I think there's so much value to be had in just understanding other people and why we have conflict with each other, and how sometimes it's not to do with them being a bad guy. Sometimes it's just we're the bad guy, or sometimes neither of us are bad guys, and it's just a misunderstanding. And I think as we evolve the self-protection industry, we have to look at the root cause of the conflicts rather than just reactive measures to, oh, this guy's got a pointy thing, make sure it doesn't go in you. Like we need to get further than that. and
Yeah.
I,
Yeah.
I think what you're doing is part of that journey. It's absolutely valid, and it's been a pleasure to speak with you about it, Bev. We're coming up on time. So for those that want to know a little bit more about you, I know you're going to hang around and do the bonus round with us in a minute, but for those that might be leaving the podcast here, if they want to know more about Asphalt Anthropology or what you do, where's the best place I can send them?
Yeah, sure. So I'm pretty active on Instagram. So you can find me there at asphalt_anthropology. My website is metro finishingschool.com. That's kind of like the central hub for everything. And if you go there, you can sign up for my newsletter. So I send out an article newsletter every month, just observations, experiences, things I've noticed on the street. So come hang out with me on Instagram, and come join the newsletter if you don't want to be beholden to algorithms of social media.
I've literally just done the same thing myself. I've now got a mailing list because I got temporarily Facebook banned due to
Oh.
so it wasn't even my fault. It was confrontation between the Australian government and Facebook, and they
Oh, yeah, they're going at it. Yeah.
yeah, they kicked off all what they called Australian news sites, and somehow my podcast got labeled a news site, so I got booted for a week, which was
Oh, yeah.
anyway.
It's a great platform, but you don't You don't own it. We don't own
That's
it.
it. Hey, self-defense. Take ownership of your own destiny.
Exactly.
All right, Bev. Let's kick in, and we'll do the bonus round in just a second. But for those leaders here, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you once again to the wonderful Beverly Baker for sharing her insights in Asphalt Anthropology. Still love that name. I think that's a real winner. Guys, thank you very much, and I apologize for the lack of video on this week's episode. Hopefully it will be all resolved for next time. I'd just like to announce we are taking a short break. As you'll be aware if you listened to last week's episode, did suffer a little bit of a loss in the family. And I will be on the road for a couple of weeks, just navigating some of those issues. So we will be away for a couple of weeks. I will advise of the actual return date in the very near future. Please stay in touch on our Facebook page, Managing Violence with Joe Saunders, or in our Facebook group, Managing Violence Tribe, or indeed on Twitter at Joe Saunders MVP, and on Instagram at Managing Violence. We're everywhere. We're not hard to find. Or, of course, check out our website, www.violencepod.com. We'll be back in a couple of weeks. Thank you very much for your time, for your patience, and for always supporting the show. Until then, I'll talk to you next time.